Hello and welcome to episode number 92 of Week in Review. My name is Sean, and on this week's show we have a Zombieland triple feature for you covering Zombieland, Zombieland Double Tap, and the video game Zombieland Double Tap Road Trip. God, that title is a mouthful. I'll also tell you about the streams happening over on twitch.tv/ShaunosaurusRex, and we'll look forward to this week's new releases. First up on this week's show, let's travel all the way back to 2009 and talk about Zombieland, which is an interesting movie to go back to because comedy seems like it's the most consistent this doesn't work anymore kind of genre. Like, dramas seem to hold out pretty well. There are like classics of animation that work, like Aladdin and Toy Story, stuff like that, but comedies feel like kind of hit or miss. And definitely for me, this one is specific because between being 19 and 29, like, a lot has changed in the last 10 years. I have different thought processes, different views. Are jokes going to play the same? Does it work all that well as a movie in general? And pleasantly it does. I actually liked this movie more than I remembered, and it's in large part to the cast and the characters that they set up. I like them enough to root for them to get through the movie. I care enough about them that I would be bummed if any of them were to not make it through the movie, and I especially like the way they implement the rules throughout the film. I like when it doesn't point them out as obviously. There's one after Woody Harrelson smashes up a car where it says like I think it's like rule 14 or something like that, but his limber up and no one makes a reference to it. It's just one of those things where he walks away and he's like, I think I pulled something to it, and then it just appears on the bumper of the car and falls over. The visual gag really got me. I think it still works. I really like the dynamic between Wichita and Little Rock and Columbus and Tallahassee. I like that they get over on them a couple of different times. I really like the first time they get over on them because I think it still works well because you don't know the rules of the world. Like, how dark is this movie really going to get? It's not going to get that dark, but are they going to be willing to do something like that? I think it can still take you by surprise. Obviously, if you see that there is a poster for the second movie, you'll know that she doesn't die, and I also just told you that she doesn't die, so there is that. I think the cameo is still really fun. It's interesting. I like the way it's cool to watch that, knowing what it is and watching them try to set it up where they don't really tip their hand at it all that much. Like, you would have no idea that Tallahassee's character loves Bill Murray that much for him to go like, oh, he's the tippy top of the A-list. And you're saying, like, who is it and who is it? And then it's like BM, and I'm like, still, I don't know who that was in 2009. I was like, I don't know, I guess someone, whatever. And then it's him, and he seems like he's having a good time, and it's a pretty fun little sequence. The Twinkie joke is still fantastic. I love that motivation for him. I love how singularly he is focused on that. When they find the hostess truck and it's like tipped over and it's snowballs, and he's like, oh, I like snowballs. And he's like, it's the coconut. It's not the flavor, it's the consistency. Still is a funny joke. I like his motivation for it, and I love the way it pays off at the very end. Not only from a joke perspective when Jesse Eisenberg shoots the box of Twinkies, but from a satisfying perspective when Little Rock has one for him and throws it to him. It's a very sweet moment. I was also really taken by the emotional reveal of Tallahassee losing his son and the talk of, like, when you take his kid away, like, what the fuck does he have to lose? And that sets up a sequence later in the movie, but it also explains so much about him, like why he is such a dick and why he's so abrasive and mean and why he is so careless with his goals and trying to find these Twinkies and maybe not making the smartest decisions. It's like, who gives a shit? He has nothing to lose. He had the one thing he loved. It's gone. And that's that. Unfortunately, with that, they kind of undercut that with a joke of, I haven't cried that hard since Titanic, and he rubs $100 bills on his eyes. And the reason I say that it undercuts it is because there's kind of a weird musical cue later in the movie when they're at Pacific Playland, where it's a very dramatic, like, cello and violin, like, build up to impactful emotional sequence, and he locks himself in the thing and he's like shooting all the guns. I feel like that's supposed to mean more, but it doesn't because they undercut the initial part with a joke. But even when they're in the thing and he's shooting the guns, he's still doing really silly, weird poses, and it just doesn't quite punch quite as hard as they seem to want it to, or they're afraid to, so they pull it back a little bit because they think, hey, we're just going to be a comedy and that's all we're going to work with. You can let a reveal like that linger a little bit longer and have the sequence of him locking himself in, sacrificing himself, have that mean more for the rest of the characters and for the audience as well. Overall, though, it's still a fun movie. It's cool to go back and watch it 10 years later and still walk away going like, yeah, thumbs up, like I still enjoyed that movie. It got me ready and excited for Double Tap, which we'll talk about here in just a couple minutes. and I don't know, it was an enjoyable rewatch. Bridging the gap between the original movie Zombieland and Zombieland Double Tap is the video game twin stick shooter Zombieland Double Tap Road Trip, and this game is not great. I rented it from Redbox, and so I paid like $3 for it or whatever it was, and even that was still like, ooh, this wasn't a great use of $3, and that's not a great sign. It's not the worst game in the world. It's a twin stick shooter, which is a very basic type of game. It's just very plain and boring. The game was a fairly short 3.5 hours long, playing through the 10 main missions. And the weirdest thing was it didn't actually cover that much of the gap between Zombieland and Zombieland Double Tap. It like takes place like 9 3/4 years instead of 10 full years, and basically you play from Pacific Playland in California, which is a weird starting spot that basically they want to use because it's recognizable from the first movie, but because it takes place so much later, it feels like kind of forced. And they try and get around and explain, like, I just wanted to start somewhere familiar. And it's like, okay, well, you could have done something more with this, but hey, whatever. And you work your way across the United States. The basic goal is to just get to Washington, D.C. It does follow a really weird plot point of Woody Harrelson's character Tallahassee and Abigail Breslin's character Little Rock trying to become president and vice president of the United States of America, trying to like Little Rock the vote, which is a thing that they use a lot because they think it is really, really funny. And it's not funny, and it doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't really tie into the movie at all. And that's the weird thing about the movie-based game genre, is they typically can't work with the movie all that well because the movie's doing different things, stuff gets cut, and then all of a sudden you're a game developer and you're like, well, where'd this scene go? I thought we were going to try and tie it in here. It's a whole mess, and this game doesn't do anything interesting. Aside from the Little Rock the Vote lame jokes that they have throughout, this is a really weirdly written game. It's not funny. It's grating at times where you're just like reading and you're like, shut up. There are times where it doesn't even seem like whoever wrote the game understood the character dynamics at the end of the first movie and how they lead into the second one, because basically it seems like Emma Stone hates Jesse Eisenberg, even though they're supposed to be like a couple and in love or something. I don't really know. It's really weird. The game is a masterclass, so don't take that in a positive way. It's going to get negative here in just a second. It's a masterclass in time padding of a game where the level designs aren't great, and the first 7 levels aren't terrible. They're get throughable. They have weird decisions where it's like, hey, this gate is locked in one area, so you have to run all the way across the map to try and find a key, but then the character that has that now has it in a different part of the map, so then you have to trek all the way back to do that, to get into the gate, to do another thing. It's really noticeable in this game because it's so dull and boring and bland. And I know that there are other games that have these sort of blockades. They're just more fun to play, so it's not quite as noticeable. This game does something really weird, though, with the last 3 levels. Levels 8, 9, and 10. The first one of these, level 8, takes place in a supermarket, and it's essentially a maze. Basically, you need to get from the back of the supermarket to the front of the supermarket, which sounds incredibly simple. But instead, the developers have made it a labyrinthian task to try and get through this stuff by putting everything they possibly can to make you start on this side and work your way down over here, and then go back up this way, and then you go through a hallway that goes all the way down over here, and then you're back up and through. And then there's even one part where you're like, you can see the exit. You're like, if I just jump over this table like any normal character human being would be able to do, like just jump over a table, not the hardest thing in the world, I'd be out of here. But instead, you have to continue your way up and work your way back down and then deal with a horde of zombies, and it's really unnecessarily long. And that was where this game really started to slide off, because I wasn't actually having the worst time with the game. I knew what I was expecting when I was going into it. It was going to be a crappy movie-based cash-in game. I spent $3 at Redbox. Level 9 and 10 made everything much worse because the developers were like, oh shoot, it's the end of the game. These levels should probably be a little bit more difficult. And they conflate difficulty with enemies on screen. So basically it feels like luck of the draw. If you can just get through some of the enemies quickly enough, you can take out their like little hive parts or whatever the hell. They just continuously spawn out of like SWAT cars and ambulances and porta potties in a really annoying way, and you have to try and blow those up before you get overrun. And the game allows you to pick up and switch weapons from like weapon caches or the trunks of cars, but it feels like it's a random gamble, and so you're almost at the mercy of the game to give you a good weapon to get through certain sections. And I found out the hard way in level 10 that there are no checkpoints in any of these levels, which is inexcusable in a game from 2019. So instead of the game feeling difficult, it just felt cheap, which means that the deaths don't feel like they are earned in any sort of way. Like, there was one time that I genuinely goofed up, and like, I shouldn't have put myself where I was. But there were a couple of other deaths that I had that didn't feel like they were my fault. It was like, I didn't get a good enough weapon to take down these things that I need to take down to stop the zombies from coming, and I don't know, I was at the mercy of the game. That being said, I did play the whole thing. Again, it only took like 3.5 hours. It's not terribly long, which is also part of the problem. There's charging $40 for this game. It does have like a new game plus mode. It does have a horde mode. You can unlock new characters from the new movie. Cool, I guess those are some additional things that you can do. It is a pretty good gamer score dump. I got over 600 gamer score in a little over 3.5 hours. Not bad. It's just such an incredibly like mediocre game, and I feel like I'm talking about it more positively than I thought I would, because I knew what I was getting into. If you had any expectations of this being an interesting or fun game, you're going to be severely disappointed. If you go in knowing that it's a very bland and boring twin stick shooter that doesn't really have any sort of personality, you're going to hear the same lines over again. It's poorly written, none of it's funny. It's not a fun experience, and it's a waste of the Zombieland brand. So now we have Zombieland Double Tap, which is a thoroughly fine movie that doesn't do anything to advance the franchise in any meaningful way. It's what you would expect from it, and it feels like a movie that, hey, if you like the first one, you're probably going to like the second one enough to think that it was good. But for me, it didn't really work. And it's interesting to look at the movie, and there are like 5 or 6 things that I'm like, this just doesn't work the way they want it to, and it feels like there are a bunch of missed opportunities for them to give the characters a little bit extra depth. Granted, any added character depth doesn't have to be much, but it would be a nice and welcome surprise for this movie to dig a little deeper with the characters it has. The first scene and the final like post-credit scenes are great examples of why I am not super thrilled with this movie. The first scene is largely useless. It introduces 3 brand new zombies in the form of the ninja, the Homer, which is largely just used as a joke, and the Hawking. I forget what they are because they don't show up at all for the rest of the movie, with the exception of the Homer being a joke twice and then a couple of casual call-outs during another scene that's actually quite useless to the movie as well. The end sequence that I'm referring to is the mid-credit scene, and I won't spoil it here, but it just felt really forced and unnecessary, and I just didn't enjoy it. It didn't feel like it was something that needed to be there. It felt like the filmmakers were looking at it going, okay, we need to put this thing in here. It's a good callback to the first movie. We can do something with that, but it ends up coming across as just kind of bland and boring. And that's how a lot of the rest of the movie feels as well. It's just kind of bland, and it's just kind of there. It's a thing that exists. There are several plot lines throughout the movie that aren't really explored to their fullest extent. A lot of the character dynamics aren't really worked with in a meaningful or interesting way, and it introduces several characters that are so incredibly one-note and bland that they are forgettable. They don't add anything to the plot. The exception to this would be Rosario Dawson, who I thought did a good job. I also just really like seeing Rosario Dawson on screen. I thought she was a nice match for Woody Harrelson's Tallahassee. There's a love triangle storyline that doesn't really work and doesn't flesh out any of the characters to show how they have changed in the prior 10 years to get to where they are now. I never really believed that Jesse Eisenberg's Columbus and Emma Stone's Wichita really liked each other all that much anyway. There was definitely an opportunity to develop something there. They just didn't go with it. This extends to the main plot of the movie, which is they're trying to go find Little Rock. They could have explored more with Tallahassee with how he deals with loss, or how hurt he is by the loss of Little Rock. How has he taken her under his wing, kind of expanding on the idea of his lost child from the first movie, kind of working with that and pulling it into the sequel. They don't really do anything with that. The movie kind of just goes, things happen. There are a couple of scenes that are way too long that add very little to the plot. There are a couple of very predictable elements to it. It's just not a movie that feels all that good to watch, and by the end I was very done with it. Mercifully, it only runs like an hour and a half, and even though I sound really negative on it, I think there is one standout sequence in this movie. There's an action like set piece during the middle-ish portion of the movie that is all supposed to be one shot, and the way the choreography works and the way the camera dips and ducks and dives through different rooms looks really cool. There were only like 2 or 3 really obvious cuts that happen in it, but it looks very fluid for the most part. All 6 of the actors that are in the scene each get something to do, and it was really interesting. I liked it mainly because I'm a sucker for one-shot takes like that, and I thought it was just kind of a cool and interesting sequence from a visual perspective. Doesn't really add anything to the plot of the movie. This is such a weird movie to review because I just feel so thoroughly like about it. There's nothing all that special about it. There's nothing that it does like offensively bad to where I'm like, this movie is terrible and you shouldn't watch it. I also didn't really find the movie particularly funny. There were a couple of like offhanded quips that were kind of chuckle worthy, but it just largely fell flat, not only from a story perspective and a character interaction, a character dynamics perspective, a character growth perspective, but even from a humor perspective, it was kind of just like, okay, like I can tell you're trying to do jokes and they feel very winky to the first movie, and this movie just didn't work for me. And I know I sound very negative about it, but if you liked the first one and you're interested in the second one, go see it. You'll probably have a better time than I did. For me, it was just a movie that I felt there were 4 or 5 things that just didn't go in an interesting enough direction for me to get any more invested in it than I already was. And I wasn't all that invested in it in the first place. Finally, on this week's show, we'll take a look at this week's new releases. There's nothing on Blu-ray. There are 2 movies of note in theaters, Black and Blue and The Lighthouse, which I'm very excited for. I have a ticket for on Thursday. And then there are 2 games that I'm also very excited for. Call of Duty Modern Warfare is back in a reimagining, reboot, new game that's coming out on Friday, along with The Outer Worlds, which is the Obsidian RPG. Call of Duty Modern Warfare will be this weekend stream on Friday and Saturday for sure. I'm not exactly sure about Sunday. I'm going to try and get through the campaign as quickly as possible. The Call of Duty campaigns typically don't take very long, so I imagine that I should be able to get through it on Friday and Saturday. So Sunday's a little bit up in the air, and then Wednesday we'll see the return of Bus Simulator. We have more tasks to complete in that game. I think we're nearing the end. I think we have all these stops unlocked, so we should be getting right down to it, and this one might be the grindiest of them yet. Thank you so much for watching this week's episode of Week in Review. If you like the content, you can scroll on down and hit that subscribe button, and then you can also scroll on down if you want, and you can tell me what you thought of Zombieland, what you thought of Zombieland Double Tap, and you can tell me if you played Zombieland Double Tap Road Trip. Be sure to check out the streams over on twitch.tv/ShaunosaurusRex on Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then check back right here every Tuesday for more Week in Review. We'll see you next week.